The message arrived at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in December, the kind of hour that turns a phone screen into a confession booth, and it said only this: "I think I waited too long, and now I don't know how to say your name out loud." I stared at the words until the room felt smaller, until the quiet of my apartment pressed in like it was listening, because for 11 months she had said almost nothing, and now, suddenly, she had said the one thing that split me open. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone in my hand, heart racing in that particular way that isn't excitement or fear but the collision of both, and I understood immediately that whatever this was about to become, it had already crossed a point of no return. Her name was Rowan, and until that night she existed mostly in the margins of my life, a soft, persistent presence online, a reaction here, a message there, never late, never early, never crossing whatever invisible line she had drawn for herself. We had matched in January, back when the year still felt new and forgiving, and our conversations had been warm but careful, like we were both testing the temperature of the water without stepping in. Then February happened, and March, and somehow she became the person who liked my posts within minutes but never commented, who watched every story but never replied, who sent the occasional "hope you're having a good day" with no follow-up, no opening for escalation. I told myself she was shy or busy or simply not that interested, and yet she never disappeared. She stayed quietly, faithfully, like a song you don't notice playing until it stops. By summer, I had stopped expecting anything from her, which was precisely when she became dangerous. There is something disarming about consistency without demand, about someone who doesn't chase you but doesn't leave either. I would see her name pop up, feel a flicker of something I refused to examine too closely, and then move on with my day. I dated other people. I went to rooftop parties and late dinners and had conversations that went nowhere. I told friends I was fine, busy, not looking for anything serious. And still, when my phone lit up with Rowan's name, I read it slower, like I was afraid of missing a hidden meaning that wasn't there. Until December, when suddenly it was... I typed and deleted a dozen responses before finally sending, "What do you mean?" And the moment it left my screen I felt exposed, as if I had admitted something without intending to. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately, then vanished, then appeared again. And with each pause my chest tightened. I imagined her somewhere else in the city, or maybe in another state, sitting with the same phone, the same hesitation, the same fear of saying too much too late. When her reply came, it was longer, and I could feel the weight of it before I even read it. "I mean, I've known since January," she wrote. "Not just that I liked you, but that liking you was going to cost me something." So I stayed quiet. I thought if I didn't move, the feeling would pass. It didn't. It just learned how to wait. I closed my eyes because the room suddenly felt too bright, too exposed. There is a particular cruelty in realizing someone has been feeling something deeply while you've been telling yourself a safer story. I had labeled her quietness as indifference because it protected me from asking harder questions. Now those questions were crowding in all at once. "Cost you what?" I asked, and I hated how vulnerable it sounded, how much I wanted the answer. Another pause, another vanishing typing indicator. Then, my real life. The one people see, the one I can't just walk away from without consequences. That was the moment the story shifted from curiosity to risk. Because attraction is easy when it exists in a vacuum, but consequences turn desire into a decision, and I could feel the ground moving under my feet. I didn't know what her real life looked like. I only knew the version of her she allowed online, thoughtful captions, carefully framed photos, a voice note once, months ago, that I had replayed more times than I cared to admit. I had never asked for more, and she had never offered. Now she was offering something, or maybe asking, and I wasn't sure which was more frightening. I asked where she was, and she told me she was sitting in her car outside her apartment because she couldn't go inside yet. I asked why, and she said because once she did, she'd lose her nerve. I imagined her in the glow of the dashboard lights, December cold pressing against the windows, the city humming around her, and the intimacy of that image caught me off guard. We were strangers in almost every practical sense, and yet here she was, choosing me as the person to tell the truth to, and that felt heavy in a way I wasn't prepared for. We talked for hours, the conversation unfolding in that halting, careful rhythm that comes from years of restraint finally loosening. She told me she had read and reread our old messages, wondering what would have happened if she'd been braver earlier. I told her I had assumed she wasn't interested, and she laughed, a small, sad admission that she had been very interested and very afraid. She didn't tell me exactly what she was afraid of, not yet, but I could hear it in the way she chose her words, in the pauses she left between sentences, like she was bracing for impact. At some point after midnight, she asked if I would be willing to meet her, just once, before the year ended. "Not a date," she said quickly, like she was afraid of pushing too hard. Just cough. Fee. A conversation that didn't have to hide behind screens. I stared at the question longer than I should have, because suddenly the story wasn't hypothetical anymore. Meeting her would collapse the distance that had kept us safe. It would turn her from a carefully curated presence into a real person with a real voice and real consequences, and I didn't know if I was ready for that. I said yes anyway. The cafe she suggested was halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral territory, and we agreed on a Saturday afternoon when the city would be loud enough to offer cover. In the days leading up to it, I found myself thinking about her in ways that surprised me, not in grand romantic fantasies, but in small, intrusive details. I wondered how tall she was, whether she gestured when she talked, if her silence in person would feel the same as it did online, or if it would crack open into something else. I told myself not to build it up, that this was just coffee, just two people closing a loop before the year ended, but my body didn't listen to reason. Every notification made my heart jump. Every December song on the radio felt like it was underscoring something I hadn't agreed to yet. When Saturday came, I arrived early and chose a table near the window, my hands wrapped around a cup I didn't need yet. I watched people pass outside, couples bundled together, friends laughing, strangers brushing past each other without consequence. And I wondered which category we would fall into by the end of the hour. When she walked in, I recognized her immediately, not because she looked exactly like her photos, but because there was a hesitation in the way she paused just inside the door, scanning the room like she was searching for a familiar shape in a crowd. Our eyes met, and something unspoken moved between us, a recognition that felt older than it should have. She smiled, tentative but real, and when she sat down across from me, the space between us felt charged, like a held breath. Up close, she was quieter than I expected, not withdrawn but careful, as if she was used to measuring the weight of her words before letting them go. We talked about easy things at first, the weather, work, the absurdity of how fast the year had gone, but underneath every sentence was the awareness of what we weren't saying yet. Every time our eyes held for a fraction too long, I felt the pull of it, the months of unspoken attention condensing into something almost visible. At one point, she reached for her coffee and our fingers brushed, accidentally, and the contact was so brief and so electric that it startled us both. She pulled her hand back, apologizing too quickly, and I realized then how much control she had been exerting all year, how much discipline it must have taken to stay quiet when everything in her body was probably urging her forward. The thought made my chest ache in a way that felt dangerously close to tenderness. Halfway through the hour, she looked at me and said, "There's something you should know before this goes any further," and the tone of her voice told me that whatever came next would change the shape of the room. I nodded because I had agreed to this moment the second I said yes to coffee, and I wasn't going to flinch now. She took a breath, then another, and when she spoke again, it was softer, steadier, like she had finally decided to stop protecting herself from the truth. "I'm not as free as you think I am," she said, and before I could ask what that meant, her phone buzzed on the table between us, the screen lighting up with a name I didn't recognize but instantly understood mattered. She looked down at it, then back at me, something like regret flickering across her face, and in that suspended second I realized December hadn't brought a confession to clear the air, it had brought a reckoning. She didn't pick up the phone, that was the first thing I noticed, the way she let it vibrate itself into silence between us, as if ignoring it were a statement she wasn't ready to translate yet. The cafe noise rushed back in all at once, cups clinking, a laugh from the table behind me, the hiss of the espresso machine, and suddenly I was acutely aware of how exposed we were, two women sitting across from each other with something unfinished hanging in the air. Rowan slid the phone face down, her fingers lingering on it like she was steadying herself. And when she looked up at me, her eyes were apologetic but resolute, the expression of someone who knows the damage and chooses honesty anyway. I didn't ask who it was. Not yet. There are moments when questions feel like weapons, and I didn't want to force her into a corner before she was ready to stand there. Instead, I said, "You don't have to explain everything right now," which was true and also a lie, because I wanted to know everything immediately, even as a small, cautious voice in my head warned me that knowing would cost me something too. She nodded, grateful, but the relief on her face only lasted a second before it was replaced by something heavier. A sadness that had clearly been living with her for a long time. "I just need you to understand that I didn't stay quiet because I didn't care," she said. "I stayed quiet because caring felt dangerous." The word settled between us, and I let it, resisting the urge to soften it or reframe it into something more manageable. Dangerous didn't mean dramatic, it meant real. It meant consequences that extended beyond hurt feelings and awkward goodbyes. I thought about the way she had occupied my year like a shadow I never fully acknowledged, and I wondered how much heavier her side of that silence had been. "Dangerous how?" I asked gently, because even patience can ask for clarity. She looked toward the window, watching someone struggle with an umbrella outside. The December rain streaking the glass like it was blurring the edges of the world. I live with someone, she said finally. Have for a while. The sentence was simple, almost bland, but my body reacted to it before my mind did. A tightening in my chest, a subtle recalibration of expectations I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Living with someone could mean many things, and I clung to that ambiguity for a beat, not because I wanted to be naive, but because I needed to understand the shape of the truth before I accepted it. A roommate, I asked, and I hated how hopeful it sounded. She shook her head once, slow and deliberate. My girlfriend. The word landed with a dull thud, not a sharp pain but a spreading ache, the kind that doesn't shock you so much, as it sinks in and starts rearranging things quietly. I nodded, because nodding felt safer than reacting, and because part of me had already known there was something like this waiting on the other side of her silence. Okay, I said, and I was surprised at how steady my voice sounded. How long? 3 years, she said. We're stable, or at least we look that way from the outside. I absorbed that, the length of time, the weight of shared routines and shared space, the history I hadn't been competing with because I hadn't known there was a competition at all. I thought about the phone lighting up on the table, the name she hadn't said, and suddenly it made sense in a way that was both clarifying and unsettling. And she doesn't know about me, I said, not as an accusation but as a fact we both needed to acknowledge. No, Rowan said quickly. I haven't crossed any physical lines, I swear, She stopped, frustrated, and ran a hand through her hair. I didn't plan for this. I didn't go looking for someone else, you just happened. There it was, the sentence that could sound flattering or selfish depending on how you held it. I let it sit, resisting the urge to dissect it immediately. The truth was, I believed her. I believed that whatever this was hadn't been engineered for drama or escape. It had crept up on her quietly, the same way it had on me, except she had more to lose when it did. That didn't make it easier, but it made it real. Why tell me now, I asked. Why December? She laughed softly, a sound without humor. Because I couldn't take another year of pretending you were just someone online. Because every holiday photo, every recap post, every best moments of the year thing made me realize how much of my year had been built around a silence that was starting to feel like a lie. She met my eyes again, and there was no escape in her gaze now. And because I'm at a point where I have to decide whether I keep choosing safety or whether I finally admit what I want. The word want pulsed between us, charged and dangerous in its own right. I thought about my own year, the dates that went nowhere, the way I had told myself I wasn't waiting for anyone while some part of me very clearly was. The difference was I hadn't been bound to anyone else while I waited. I hadn't been making promises I might have to break. The asymmetry of it all made my stomach twist. I don't want to be the reason you hurt someone, I said quietly. I know, she replied, and I don't want to turn you into a secret or a mistake. That's why I needed to tell you before anything else happened, before you decided whether this was something you could even consider. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows like punctuation, and for a moment neither of us spoke. I realized then that this wasn't about whether I liked her or even whether she liked me. That part was already clear. This was about thresholds and lines and the kind of person I wanted to be when things got complicated. It would have been easier if she had been careless or dishonest. It would have given me an excuse to step away cleanly. Instead, she was being careful now, even if she hadn't been earlier, and that made the decision heavier. I need time, I said finally, and it felt like the most honest thing I could offer. Not because. Say I don't care, but because I do. She nodded, relief and disappointment tangling in her expression. I'm not asking you to decide anything today, she said. I just didn't want to keep pretending this was nothing. We finished our coffee in a quieter rhythm after that, the conversation shifting to safer ground without ever fully leaving the dangerous one behind. When we stood to leave, there was a hesitation at the door, an awareness of how charged even a goodbye could be now. She hugged me briefly, carefully, like she was afraid of crossing a line she had just drawn so deliberately, and when we stepped back, the space between us felt louder than any contact would have. Over the next week, December seemed determined to test my resolve. Everywhere I went, the city was saturated with endings and beginnings, office parties and final deadlines, and people making plans for the year ahead. Rowan didn't disappear, but she didn't push either. Our messages were softer, more deliberate, like we were both aware that every word carried more weight now. I found myself replaying the cafe conversation in my head at odd moments, wondering where the line between understanding and self-protection really was. Then, one night, she broke the careful balance. I was halfway through a late dinner when my phone buzzed, and her name lit up the screen with a message that made my chest tighten before I even opened it. "Can we talk?" she wrote. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. I stepped outside into the cold to call her, my breath visible in the air, the city lights blurring as I walked. When she answered, her voice was unsteady in a way I hadn't heard before. and that alone told me something had shifted. "She knows something's wrong," Rowan said without preamble. "Not about you exactly, but about me. She asked me tonight if I was in love with someone else." The words landed hard, the consequences she had hinted at now stepping fully into the light. "What did you say?" I asked, my heart pounding. "I said I didn't know," she replied, and I could hear the guilt threaded through every syllable. And that felt worse than lying. I leaned against a brick wall, the cold seeping through my coat, and realized that whatever distance I thought I still had was already closing. This wasn't a story unfolding at arm's length anymore. This was a collision, and I was standing directly in its path. "Rowan," I said carefully, "what are you asking me right now?" There was a pause, longer than any before, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm asking you if there's any part of you that would still want this, knowing what it might cost both of us." The question hung there, unanswered, as a car passed and splashed through a puddle nearby, and I understood that whatever I said next would redraw the boundaries of my year in ways I couldn't yet predict. I didn't answer her right away, not because I didn't have a response, but because every honest one felt like a door I couldn't close again once I touched it. The city noise around me blurred into something distant and unreal, and for a moment all I could hear was the soft rush of my own blood, the physical evidence of how much her question had already implicated me. Wanting something doesn't usually announce itself as a choice with consequences. It sneaks in disguised as curiosity, as kindness, as coincidence. Now it was standing in front of me, asking to be acknowledged by name. "I don't know," I said finally, and the truth of it surprised me with its steadiness. "I know I don't want to be collateral damage in someone else's life, and I know I don't want to be the reason you hurt someone you've shared years with. But I also know pretending this doesn't matter would be a lie." I paused, pressing my free hand against the cold brick as if grounding myself. "So yes, there's a part of me that still wants this. That's the part that scares me." She exhaled, a sound that carried relief and sorrow in equal measure. "That's fair," she said quietly. "I don't want to rush you or trap you into anything. I needed to know whether I was imagining the connection or whether it was real on your side too." "It's real," I said before I could overthink it. The admission felt like a small rupture, not dramatic but decisive. "That doesn't mean I know what to do with it." "Neither do I," she replied. And there was something almost comforting in that shared uncertainty. We stayed on the phone for a while longer, not trying to solve anything, just acknowledging the shape of the problem out loud. When we hung up, I stood there in the cold for another minute, letting the night settle around me, aware that I had crossed an internal line even if nothing external had changed yet. The days that followed felt suspended, like the week between Christmas and New Year when time loses its usual structure and everything feels provisional. Rowan and I kept talking, but carefully, orbiting the edges of what we weren't ready to name. She told me her girlfriend's name was Elise, that they had built a life together that looked solid from the outside, shared friends and routines, and an apartment full of objects that told a story of continuity. She didn't paint Elise as a villain or a placeholder, and that honesty complicated my feelings in ways I hadn't anticipated. It would have been easier if there had been something obviously wrong with that relationship, some clear justification for its unraveling. Instead, what she described was a quiet misalignment that had grown over time, subtle enough to ignore until it wasn't. I found myself thinking about Elise in unexpected moments, imagining her moving through the same apartment Rowan had described, unaware that the ground beneath her relationship was starting to shift. The empathy I felt made me feel both more human and more trapped. Wanting Rowan didn't cancel out my understanding of Elise's position, it sharpened it. I wondered if that meant I was already in too deep. A few days before Christmas, Rowan asked if we could see each other again. "Not in public this time," she said, "but somewhere quieter, somewhere we could talk without feeling watched." The request made my stomach flip, a mix of anticipation and caution. I agreed, on the condition that we keep it about conversation, not escalation. She agreed immediately, and the speed of that agreement told me she was just as aware of the stakes. We met at a small park near my place, bare trees etched against a gray winter sky, the ground littered with damp leaves. There was something fitting about the setting, stripped back and honest, no distractions to hide behind. We walked side by side, our shoulders occasionally brushing, each contact sending a jolt through me that I tried not to react to. When we sat on a cold bench, she turned to face me fully, her posture open in a way that felt deliberate. "I talked to Elise again," she said, not easing into it. I told her I was confused, that I felt disconnected and didn't know what that meant yet. "And?" I asked, bracing myself. "She's scared," Rowan said, not angry, just scared. She asked me if I was willing to work on us, to try counseling, to slow down and figure out what's missing. She looked down at her hands. And I said yes, because I owe her that. The words landed softly but firmly, and I felt a familiar tightening in my chest, a mixture of disappointment and respect. "That makes sense," I said, and I meant it. If she had said anything else, it would have changed how I saw her, not necessarily for the better. I needed you to know, she continued, because I don't want to keep you in a holding pattern while I sort this out. That wouldn't be fair to you. A part of me wanted to tell her to take all the time she needed, that I would wait quietly the way she had waited all year, but I recognized the impulse for what it was, self-erasure dressed up as devotion. I appreciate you telling me, I said instead. I don't know what this means for us, but I'm glad you're being honest. We sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of unsaid possibilities pressing in. Then she asked the question I hadn't known I was dreading. Can you still talk to me while I'm doing this? Or is that too much to ask? I considered it carefully because this was another threshold. Staying connected could mean staying hopeful, and hope has a way of making time stretch painfully. But cutting her off completely felt abrupt, like denying the reality of what had already happened between us. We can talk, I said slowly. But I need us to be clear about what that is. I can't be your escape or your emotional backup plan. She nodded immediately. I don't want you to be, she said. I just don't want to lose you entirely. The honesty in that admission softened something in me. Let's take it one day at a time, I said. No promises we can't keep. Christmas came and went in a blur of obligations and surface-level cheer. I spent time with family, exchanged gifts, smiled for photos, all while carrying the quiet knowledge that something unresolved was unfolding just out of sight. Rowan sent a message on Christmas morning wishing me peace, not happiness, a choice of words that felt intentional. I replied with something equally measured, and we let the day pass without pushing further. On New Year's Eve, the city felt electric with expectation, everyone eager to mark an ending, to declare something finished or begun. I had plans with friends, a small gathering that promised distraction if not clarity. As midnight approached, I found myself checking my phone more often than I wanted to admit. When a message from Rowan finally appeared, it wasn't a dramatic confession or a plea. It was a simple question. Are you okay tonight? I stepped outside as fireworks began to crackle in the distance, the sound echoing off buildings. I am, I typed back after a moment. Are you? There was a pause longer than usual. Then I don't know. I think tonight makes everything feel louder. I leaned against the railing, watching sparks bloom and fade in the sky, and felt the truth of that settle in. Endings have a way of amplifying what we've been trying to ignore. You don't have to have answers tonight, I wrote. Neither of us does. Her reply came quickly this time. Thank you for not making this harder than it already is, as the countdown reached 0 and cheers erupted around me. I realized that the year wasn't ending with a resolution, but with a suspension, a fragile understanding that whatever came next would require patience and courage in equal measure. The fireworks faded, smoke drifting through the cold air, and I felt a strange mix of hope and grief settle in my chest. We had acknowledged something real without claiming it, named a desire without acting on it, and that restraint felt both responsible and unbearably intimate. A few days into January, Rowan called me unexpectedly. Her voice sounded different, steadier but edged with exhaustion. I don't want to drag this out, she said after we exchanged brief greetings. Counseling starts next week. Elise and I are going to honestly try to see if there's something here worth saving. She paused. I need to step back from us while I do that. Not forever, but enough to know I'm making a clean choice, whatever it is. I closed my eyes, absorbing the finality in her tone. This wasn't a door slamming shut, but it was closing, at least for now. I understand, I said, and the steadiness of my own voice surprised me. I think that's the only way any of this stays fair. I'm scared I'll lose you, she admitted. You might, I replied gently, or you might not. That's part of the risk. She laughed softly, a sound threaded with sadness. You're right, I just needed to hear it out loud. When we hung up, the apartment felt unusually quiet, as if the absence of our constant low-level communication had already begun to register. I didn't know what the next months would bring, whether distance would dull the connection or sharpen it, whether Rowan would find her way back to Elise or toward something entirely new. All I knew was that we had chosen honesty over impulse, clarity over fantasy, and that choice, as difficult as it was, felt like the foundation of whatever ending, or beginning, was still waiting ahead. The weeks after that call rearranged my days in small, quiet ways. There was no dramatic fallout, no sudden absence that echoed loudly enough for others to notice. It was subtler than that. I stopped reaching for my phone during idle moments. I filled evenings with errands I'd been postponing, with long walks and early nights and a deliberate effort to stay inside my own life. Rowan didn't vanish entirely, but the space between our messages stretched, respectful and intentional, like a boundary we were both afraid to test. Knowing the reason for the distance didn't make it painless, but it did make it clean, and that mattered more than I'd expected. January softened into February, the city shedding its holiday gloss and settling back into routine. I dated again, cautiously, not because I was trying to replace anything, but because I refused to let myself calcify around a single unresolved story. Some dates were pleasant, some forgettable, none dangerous. They didn't carry the same quiet intensity Rowan had, the sense of a conversation unfolding on multiple levels at once. But they reminded me that connection wasn't a finite resource. Wanting one person didn't erase the possibility of wanting others, it just complicated the timing. I didn't ask for updates, and Rowan didn't volunteer them, which felt like a mutual act of restraint rather than avoidance. Still, I thought about her more than I wanted to admit, wondering how counseling was going, whether Elise was finding words for fears she hadn't known how to name before, whether Rowan was learning something new about herself or simply confirming what she already knew. I told myself that not knowing was part of the agreement, part of respecting the choice she'd made to step back fully. Curiosity, I learned, is easier to manage than hope. The call came on an ordinary Thursday evening, the kind of night that doesn't announce itself as a turning point. I almost didn't pick up, not because I didn't want to hear her voice, but because some part of me sensed that answering would pull me back into a story I'd been carefully holding at arm's length. When I did, her voice was calm, steadier than I remembered, and that steadiness carried its own gravity. "I didn't plan to call you tonight," she said after a brief hello. "But I realized I was waiting for the right moment, and there isn't one." I leaned against my kitchen counter, letting the familiar sound of her breathing settle my nerves. "Okay," I said. "What's going on?" "We've been honest," she began, and the word honest felt like a thesis statement for everything that followed. Elise was leaving behind. She was calling because the story had reached a point where honesty required a witness. "I'm sorry," I said, "because endings deserve acknowledgement even when they're necessary." "Thank you," she replied. "And I want you to know something else before you decide what this means for you. I don't expect anything, not now, not ever. I just couldn't move forward without telling you where I landed." I closed my eyes, absorbing the restraint in her words, the way she was leaving room for my agency, instead of filling it with expectation. "I appreciate that," I said. "I'm glad you told me." There was a moment of silence then, comfortable but charged, the kind that feels like a question waiting to be asked. She let it hang, and I realized that this time, if there was going to be a next step, it would have to come from me. The responsibility was oddly grounding. "Rowan," I said slowly, "I'm not the same person I was in December. I wouldn't expect you to be," she said softly. "I don't want to pick up where we left off like nothing happened," I continued. "If there's anything between us, it has to be new. No ghosts, no borrowed timelines." "I agree," she said without hesitation. "I wouldn't want it any other way." We didn't make plans that night. We didn't rush to define anything. We let the conversation end where it needed to, with the truth spoken and the future left intentionally blank. When we hung up, I felt lighter than I had in months, not because something had been resolved for me, but because it finally could be. A week later, she asked if I wanted to get coffee again, the same cafe, the same neutral ground. The symmetry wasn't lost on either of us. This time, when she walked in, there was no hesitation at the door, no scanning the room with guarded eyes. She saw me and smiled, unguarded, and something in my chest loosened in response. We sat across from each other, the space between us familiar but altered, no longer loaded with secrecy or deferred decisions. We talked about everything except us at first, about work and books, and the strange elasticity of time when life is in transition. When the conversation finally circled closer, it felt natural rather than forced. "I've been thinking a lot about how we started," she said. "About all that quiet." "Me too," I admitted. "I don't regret it, though. It taught me something about patience, about not confusing intensity with immediacy." She nodded, thoughtful. "I used to think silence meant safety. Now I think it just means delay." The honesty of that made me smile. "So what do you want now?" I asked, not as a test but as an invitation. She considered the question carefully, as she always did. "I want to get to know you without hiding," she said, slowly. "I want to see who we are when nothing is being postponed." The simplicity of it was disarming. "I want that too," I said, and the alignment felt real, not imagined. We walked out together, the late afternoon light slanting across the street, and when she reached for my hand, she did it openly, without flinching. The contact was gentle, grounding, not an explosion but a confirmation. It didn't feel like the culmination of a long wait so much as the beginning of something that could finally exist in the open. In the weeks that followed, we moved forward deliberately, not out of fear, but out of respect for everything that had come before. We learned each other in daylight and in ordinary moments, building something that didn't rely on secrecy or scarcity to feel significant. There were still uncertainties, still adjustments to be made, but they belonged to us now, not to a year spent waiting. One evening, as we sat on my couch, the city quiet outside the window, Rowan turned to me and said, "I used to think December was when everything finally broke open. Now I think it was just when the truth stopped being patient." I leaned into her, feeling the steadiness of that insight settle between and us. Sometimes that's enough, I said, and it was, if this story stayed with you, follow along for more moments like this.